My mother's laughter was the sharpest thing in the room, cutting through the silence of my sister's pristine living room. "Face it, Sarah," she sneered, her eyes scanning Victoria's designer furniture with a look of worship I had never received. "You're just jealous of your sister. Stop pretending your little career is going anywhere. You'll never have a life or a house like hers." Beside her, my father, George, just nodded in silence, his lack of defense hurting more than the words themselves. Victoria didn't say a word. She just offered me that same pitying smile she'd used since we were kids, adjusted her diamond earring, and asked if I wanted more tea. They had no idea that for the last 3 years, while they were busy calling me the family disappointment, I had been building an empire in the shadows. The jealous sister they saw standing there actually held the deed to a property that would make this house look like a servant's quarters. And tomorrow, when Victoria walks through my front door, the lies they've told themselves for years are finally going to shatter. Before we get into the moment she froze at my front door, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories of justice and success. You won't want to miss the twist in this one. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass of my home office, reflecting off the sleek obsidian desk that felt a world away from the dusty, cramped apartment my parents still pictured me in. Every morning followed a precise rhythm. Coffee at 6, market analysis at 7, and by 8 I was managing the property portfolios that had quietly made me a millionaire before my 30th birthday. To the world, I was a ghost, a corporate entity known only as the director of Lennox Holdings. To my family, I was Sarah, the unstable freelancer who couldn't even afford a decent pair of shoes for Christmas. I stared at the framed photo on my desk, the only one I kept, of the 4 of us at Victoria's housewarming party 2 years ago. My mother, Vivian, was beaming, her arm draped around Victoria as if she'd won a trophy. I was standing on the edge of the frame, blurred and overlooked. That day, Vivian had pulled me aside to whisper that I should ask Victoria for a loan so I wouldn't embarrass the family with my old car anymore. I didn't tell her that I had just closed a 6-figure deal that morning. I didn't tell her that the very car she mocked was a conscious choice to stay invisible, until I was ready to strike. The escalation of their disdain had become a sport. Every Sunday dinner was a minefield of helpful suggestions on how I could be more like Victoria. Victoria who married well. Victoria who lived in a gated community. Victoria the masterpiece to my rough draft. My father's silent nods were the rhythmic drumbeat to my mother's verbal lashings. They had built a pedestal for my sister out of the bricks they used to pelt me. But the facade was getting heavy. As I sat in my quiet sanctuary, the sheer scale of the deception began to weigh on me. I wasn't just hiding money. I was hiding a completely different version of myself, a woman who was powerful, decisive, and feared in the boardroom. The tension between the daughter they mocked and the CEO I had become was stretching to a breaking point. My phone vibrated on the desk. It was a text from Victoria, dripping with that trademark artificial sweetness. "Checking in, sis. Still coming for tea today? Don't worry if your place is a mess. I'm used to it. LOL." I looked out over the sprawling estate I called home, the infinity pool bleeding into the horizon. I gripped the edge of my desk until my knuckles turned white. The time for hiding was over. I wasn't just inviting her for tea. I was inviting her into the lion's den. As I typed back a simple asterisk, "See you at 3," asterisk, a second notification popped up on my screen, an urgent high-priority alert from my property management software. My heart skipped a beat as I read the address of the property in crisis. It wasn't one of my commercial buildings. It was Victoria's home address, and the legal notice attached to it was about to change everything before she even stepped foot on my porch. The drive to Victoria's neighborhood always felt like a journey through a curated museum of mediocrity. Every lawn was mowed to the same height, and every house was painted in the same shades of beige, a suburban trap that my mother, Vivian, treated like the peak of human achievement. As I pulled my unremarkable sedan into Victoria's driveway for our weekly forced gathering, I saw my father, George, already out front, admiring Victoria's new flower beds with a reverence he never showed for anything I did. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive candles and unearned superiority. Victoria was in the kitchen, posing more than cooking, her movements fluid and practiced. "Oh, Sarah, you're actually on time," she chirped, her eyes darting to my simple outfit with a flick of disappointment. "I was just telling Mom that we should probably look through my old wardrobe later. I have some pieces that are far too high-end for me now, but they'd be perfect for your interviews." Vivian let out that sharp, melodic laugh that always signaled a looming attack. "That's so generous of you, Victoria. But you know, Sarah, she's always been content with the bare minimum. It's a shame, really. If only you had half your sister's drive, you wouldn't be living in that little rental on the edge of town." I kept my face a mask of neutral boredom, even as the fire in my chest grew. They had spent years perfecting this routine. Victoria was the gold standard, and I was the cautionary tale. The escalation didn't stop at the table. Throughout lunch, Victoria regaled us with stories of her exclusive social club and the upcoming renovations she was planning for the patio, renovations she claimed would cost more than my annual salary. My father just nodded, his silence acting as the foundation for the pedestal they had built for her. "Success looks good on you, honey," he muttered to Victoria, the only time he spoke all afternoon. I watched Victoria's smug expression, realizing that her entire identity was built on the belief that she was untouchable. She truly believed she was the landlord of our family's pride. Every boast, every pitying offer of hand-me-downs was a brick in a wall that was about to come crashing down. She had no idea that while she was busy playing house in a life she couldn't actually afford, I had been buying up the very ground she stood on. As I stood up to leave, I caught sight of a letter on the console table by the door. It was an official envelope from the local council regarding zoning violations, the same crisis my management software had alerted me to earlier. Victoria saw me looking and snatched it away with a nervous laugh. "Just boring paperwork, Sarah. Nothing someone in your position would understand." I smiled, a real cold smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I'm sure you'll handle it, Victoria. But just in case you can't, I'll see you at my place at 3. Don't be late." I walked out, leaving them in their gilded cage, knowing that within the hour, a legal process I set in motion would strip the golden child of her crown before she even reached my driveway. The dinner table felt like a courtroom, where the verdict had been decided before I even sat down. Vivian had insisted on a celebratory meal at a high-end bistro to toast Victoria's latest social achievement, but the celebration was merely a thin veil for my public dissection. As the waiter poured a wine that probably cost more than my parents thought I made in a month, Vivian leaned in, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "You know, Sarah, it's not just about the money," she began, her voice carrying across the quiet restaurant. "It's about the lack of ambition. Looking at Victoria's life is like looking at a masterpiece, while yours is just a series of scribbles." I gripped my fork, the metal biting into my palm as the escalation reached a fever pitch. Victoria didn't even look up from her salad, merely swirling her glass with a practiced, elegant indifference. "Mom, don't be so hard on her," Victoria cooed, though the poison in her tone was unmistakable. "Sarah is just comfortable being average. She's always been content with the scraps. It's a personality trait, really. You're just jealous of my life, because it requires a level of discipline you'll never understand." The air in the room seemed to thicken. I looked at George, my father, hoping for a flicker of dissent, a moment of paternal protection. Instead, he took a slow sip of his water and nodded, his gaze fixed firmly on the tablecloth. "Your mother is right, Sarah," he muttered, his voice a heavy final blow. "You spend so much time looking at what Victoria has that you've forgotten how to build anything for yourself. It's pathetic to watch." The humiliation was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that made my vision blur at the edges. They weren't just criticizing my life, they were attempting to erase my identity, rewriting my years of sacrifice and strategic planning as a narrative of failure and envy. I realized then that no amount of subtle success would ever be enough to change their minds. They didn't want me to succeed. They needed me to fail so that Victoria's pedestal stayed high. "Is that what you think?" I asked, my voice coming out as a low, dangerous whisper that cut through Vivian's next insult. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, heavy velvet box, not with a gift, but with the key that represented the end of their era. I set it on the table between the appetizers and the wine. "You think I'm jealous of a house with a leaking roof and a mounting debt to a landlord you've never met?" Victoria's face paled instantly, her hand trembling as she reached for her glass. "What are you talking about?" she hissed, her eyes darting to the box. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the bistro floor, drawing the attention of every patron in the room. "I'm talking about the fact that your masterpiece is built on sand, Victoria. And I'm talking about tea tomorrow. 3 o'clock. As I walked away, leaving the bill and the heavy box on the table, I heard the distinctive sound of Victoria's phone chiming, a notification of a final eviction warning that I had personally authorized minutes before sitting down. The air in my office felt charged with a quiet, lethal energy as I prepared for the afternoon. Everything was in place, the scent of sandalwood lingering in the air, the soft hum of the climate control, and the folder resting on the kitchen island that contained the final blow to Victoria's manufactured reality. After the dinner from hell, I had stopped playing the part of the victim. The time for subtle hints had evaporated the moment George nodded along to my mother's pathetic label. I spent the morning reviewing the logistics. My management team had confirmed that the final eviction notice had been hand-delivered to Victoria's beige palace just an hour ago. The timing was surgical. She would arrive here at the peak of her panic, looking for a shoulder to cry on or, more likely, a way to vent her frustrations on me to regain her sense of power. I watched the security monitors as a car pulled up to the heavy iron gates at the edge of my property. It wasn't my parents' car. It was Victoria's. I could see her through the high-definition lens, sitting in her driver's seat, her face a mask of utter confusion. She sat there for a full minute, staring at the intercom and the massive stone pillars that guarded the entrance to my estate. She probably thought she had the wrong address, that her GPS had finally glitched and sent her to the home of some local billionaire. I pressed the release button, the gates swinging open with a silent, motorized grace. As she drove up the long, winding driveway lined with ancient oaks, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching her descent into reality. She parked her car, the one Vivian had told me to borrow money for, next to the fountain, looking small and insignificant against the scale of the house. When she stepped out, she didn't look like the golden child anymore. She looked frail, clutching her designer bag like a life raft, her eyes darting around the architecture with a mixture of awe and dawning horror. I opened the front door before she could even reach for the bell. The escalation was instantaneous. The moment she looked past me into the sprawling, marble-clad foyer, she didn't just stop. She recoiled as if I had struck her. "Sarah?" she whispered, her voice cracking, the smugness that had defined her for 30 years vanishing in a heartbeat. What is this? Whose house is this?" I stepped back, gesturing for her to enter the sanctuary she had spent a lifetime claiming I'd never deserve. "I told you, Victoria," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "I moved into my new place. Come in. The tea is already getting cold, and we have a lot to discuss, starting with that letter you received this morning." I watched her foot cross the threshold, and as she took her first step onto the polished stone, the look of pure, paralyzing shock on her face was better than any apology I could have ever imagined. But as she opened her mouth to speak, my phone rang. It was Vivian, and the sound of her screaming through the receiver was loud enough for Victoria to hear every word. Victoria stood in my foyer, her designer heels clicking erratically against the heated marble floors. She looked like a trapped animal, her head whipping from the 20-foot vaulted ceilings to the original oil paintings that lined the hallway. The air between us was thick, vibrating with the sound of my mother's voice still shrieking through the phone I held in my hand. "Sarah, answer me right now." Vivian's voice was distorted by a mixture of rage and genuine panic. "Victoria just sent me a photo of a gate. Why is she at a gate? Did you lead her to some construction site to humiliate her? Where are you?" I didn't look at the phone. I kept my eyes locked on Victoria, whose face had transitioned from a pale white to a sickly shade of gray. She was staring at a silver-framed document sitting on the entryway console. It was the business license for Lennox Holdings. The realization was visible, a physical tremor starting in her hands and moving up her arms. "Mom," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible over the phone's speaker. "Mom, shut up. Don't you tell me to shut up, Victoria," Vivian yelled, George's muffled voice echoing in the background, likely egging her on. "I'm calling the police. Sarah has finally lost her mind. She's probably trespassing." "She's not trespassing," Victoria suddenly screamed, the sound echoing off the glass walls. She turned to me, her eyes wide and bloodshot. "Sarah, tell me this is a joke. Tell me you're just the house sitter. Tell me you didn't buy this with the money you stole from us." The escalation was delicious. The golden child was finally breaking, her mind unable to process a reality where I wasn't the failure she needed me to be. I calmly ended the call with Vivian, plunging the room into a silence so heavy it felt like lead. "Nobody stole anything, Victoria," I said, stepping closer until she had to lean back against the wall. "While you were busy spending your perfect husband's salary on handbags to impress a mother who only loves you for your status, I was working. I was investing. I was becoming the person you only pretend to be." I leaned in, my voice dropping to a whisper that cut deeper than any shout. "And about that wrong address you thought you had. You didn't. But you are at the wrong house. Because as of 9 o'clock this morning, the owner of your little beige rental terminated your lease for chronic zoning violations and unpaid property taxes." Victoria's breath hitched, a strangled sob escaping her throat. She fumbled with her phone, her fingers shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. "I'll call the landlord. I'll fix it. He's a reasonable man, The landlord isn't a man, Victoria." I reached into the folder on the island and pulled out the eviction decree, sliding it across the stone toward her. At the very bottom, in bold, black ink, was my signature next to the corporate seal of Lennox Holdings. "And she is definitely not feeling reasonable today." Victoria stared at the signature, her knees finally giving out. She collapsed onto the marble, the high-stakes reality of her homelessness hitting her at the exact same moment my front gates buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a car. It was a moving truck I had pre-ordered, and it was backed by a police escort. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, I realized Vivian and George were in the car right behind them, coming to witness the total annihilation of the daughter they worshipped. The silence that followed my revelation was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic, frantic thudding of Victoria's heart against the marble floor. She looked up at me, her eyes glazed with a mixture of terror and disbelief, the eviction notice trembling in her hand. The golden child was gone, replaced by a broken woman realizing her entire world was a house of cards I had just blown down. You're Lennox Holdings? She stammered, her voice a hollow shell of its former smugness. All this time I was paying you? You watched me struggle to make rent last month and said nothing. I didn't watch you struggle, Victoria, I corrected, my voice cold and surgical. I watched you buy a $5,000 watch instead of paying your bills. I watched you brag about your success at dinner, while my accounting department was flagging your delinquency. You didn't want a sister. You wanted a spectator for your fake life. Well, now you have a landlord. The escalation hit its peak as the heavy front doors were thrown open. Vivian and George burst in, their faces contorted with a righteous fury that instantly evaporated. They froze 3 steps into the foyer. My mother's mouth hung open, her eyes darting from the sparkling chandelier to the expansive view of the valley, then down to Victoria, who was still crumpled on the floor. The sight of her perfect daughter defeated in a palace owned by her failure of a child seemed to short-circuit Vivian's brain. What is this? George finally gasped, his voice cracking. He looked at me, then at the luxury surrounding him, his silent agreement from the previous nights replaced by a stunned, pathetic confusion. Sarah, whose house is this? Who is paying for this? I am, Dad, I said, walking toward them with the poise of a woman who had finally claimed her throne. I own this house. I own the company that owns Victoria's house. And right now, I'm the only reason the police outside haven't started throwing Victoria's masterpiece furniture onto the sidewalk. Vivian let out a strangled cry, her hands flying to her face. You did this? You're throwing your sister out? After everything we did for you? You're just doing this because you're jealous. Even now, the old lie was her only weapon. She stepped toward me, her finger trembling as she pointed at my chest. You think money makes you better than her? You're a monster, Sarah. A spiteful, jealous monster. I didn't flinch. I let her scream until her voice went hoarse, the high stakes of the family's collapse vibrating in the air. I'm not jealous, Mom, I said, my voice echoing with a terrifying finality. I'm the one in charge now. I turned my gaze to the window, where the police officers were stepping out of their vehicles. One of them held a crowbar and a set of heavy-duty locks. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized the final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. And since you're all here, I whispered, there's one more truth about Victoria's perfect husband that the police are here to discuss. And it's going to make homelessness the least of your problems. The color drained from my mother's face as the word police hit the air. She looked at the front gates, then back at me, her bravado crumbling into a frantic, stuttering mess. Her husband? What does Thomas have to do with the police? She gasped. Victoria, still on the floor, suddenly scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting toward the window with a look of pure, unadulterated terror that told me she already knew. She didn't look at me. She looked at the phone in her shaking hand as it began to ring. It was the hysterical call I had been waiting for. Victoria answered it on speaker, her fingers fumbling, and Thomas's voice exploded into the room, raw with panic. Victoria, they're at the office. The feds are here. They've frozen everything. The accounts, the cards, even the house is flagged for seizure because of the business loans. He was sobbing, a broken man on the other end of the line. They said the owner of the property turned over the internal ledgers. They know everything, Victoria. We're ruined. Vivian let out a strangled, high-pitched wail, turning to George for a support that wasn't there. My father was staring at me as if I were a stranger, his face a mask of dawning realization. He finally saw the failure he had mocked for years as the architect of his son-in-law's downfall. The escalation was absolute. The family's golden child wasn't just losing her house, she was losing her freedom. You turned them in? Victoria shrieked, lunging toward me, her face contorted in a mask of desperation. You did this to your own family. You're a cold-blooded snake, Sarah. You didn't just want the house, you wanted to destroy us. She was inches from my face, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but I didn't move an inch. I stood my ground as the police officers reached the front porch, their heavy boots thudding with the weight of inevitable consequence. I didn't destroy you, Victoria. You and Thomas did that when you started laundering money through a property I owned, I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria like a blade. I just decided to stop being your accomplice by silence. I turned to the door as the lead officer stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Victoria. The high-stakes tension in the room was suffocating. Vivian grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, her voice a desperate, pathetic whisper. Sarah, please, tell them you made a mistake. Tell them it's all yours, that she's innocent. You have the money, you can fix this. I looked down at her hand on my arm, the same hand that had gestured in mockery at me just days before, and slowly peeled it off. It's too late for lies, Mom, I said, stepping back to let the officers proceed. But as the handcuffs clicked shut around Victoria's wrists, the officer turned his gaze toward George and Vivian, pulling a second set of documents from his belt. George and Vivian Jackson? He asked, and as my parents froze in place, I realized the truth I had uncovered went much deeper than just Victoria's greed. It reached all the way back to the bank accounts my parents thought were hidden from everyone. The clicking of the handcuffs was the only sound in the room, a sharp, metallic punctuation mark to my sister's fallen status. Victoria was being led toward the door, her head bowed, her designer heels dragging across the marble she had so desperately coveted. But the air remained thick, with a secondary, more suffocating tension. The lead officer turned his gaze toward my parents, his expression unyielding as he held up the second set of documents, the ones that linked the unambitious daughter's forensic audit to my parents' own secret financial skeletons. George and Vivian Jackson, the officer repeated, his voice echoing through the vaulted foyer. We have a warrant to seize all assets related to the undisclosed offshore accounts linked to Lennox Holdings subsidiary. You were listed as the primary beneficiaries of the funds Thomas was diverting. Vivian's knees buckled. She reached out to grasp the edge of my obsidian desk, the very desk she would have mocked for being too modern just hours ago. George didn't even try to speak. He simply collapsed into a chair, looking every bit the frail, defeated man he had tried to hide behind his silent judgments. The high stakes of their lifelong deception had finally caught up to them. They hadn't just favored Victoria, they had used her perfection as a front for their own greed. I stood at the center of the room, the only person left standing tall. The escalation of the last decade, the insults, the comparisons, the jealousy accusations, all culminated in this one moment of absolute clarity. You were right about one thing, Mom, I said, my voice steady and devoid of the anger that used to consume me. I was never going to be like my sister. I was never going to build a life on a foundation of lies and someone else's shadow. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and watched as the police cars pulled away, taking the golden child to a cell and leaving my parents in a house they couldn't afford to stand in. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the room felt tilted. I looked at the keys on my desk, the keys to the truth. I wasn't just the landlord of their homes. I was now the guardian of their freedom. The moving trucks will be at your house by morning, George, I said, addressing my father by his name for the first time. I've arranged for a small apartment in the city. It's modest, it's unambitious, but it's all you have left. As they walked out of my home in a dazed, broken silence, I realized that the greatest success wasn't the marble or the millions. It was the silence that finally followed their departure. The truth hadn't just set me free, it had silenced the mockers forever. If you enjoyed this story of ultimate revenge and secret success, make sure to hit that like button right now. It helps us bring more stories like this to life. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of justice being served. What would you have done if you were in Sarah's shoes? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one.